The Elder Scrolls series has a level scaling problem, or so people tell me. I think it's a little more complicated than that, so let's talk about it. Ever since the series' origins in Elder Scrolls 1: The Arena, the Elder Scrolls series has featured enemies that are as strong or at least close to the player in strength. Since the developers of these open world games have no way of knowing when a player is going to be where, they scale the enemy's level to fit the player's level. In the first game, the main quest dungeons would be of a consistent level of power so that players could over-prepare for them or try to tackle them early. But the rest of the world kept pace with the player. This was the best of both worlds, giving the player the whole sandbox to explore, but making sure that the player could use the role-playing game mechanics at their disposal to prepare for and complete the main quest in a way they felt most comfortable doing. Elder Scrolls 2 Daggerfall used more level scaling, but fixed level monsters that existed based on the quests you were doing. From there, well, things get complicated. The primary sentiment I hear online is a simple one. Level scaling sucks. That's what people who play Elder Scrolls for Oblivion tell me, and for the most part, it's true. Oblivion is a hard game to create a consistent challenge for because the game developers had no idea where the player was going to be or what kind of build they would be using. Not all character classes in the game were created equal, and even then, 90% of players would choose the custom class option every time. In the previous game, however, Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind, it was just assumed that you were going to die if you were wandering around in random caves, because the difficulty was, for the most part, scaled to how far in those quest lines that took you to those caves were. This wasn't always true, and there were speed bumps like Snowy Granius there to test the player and remind them to go check up on what they were doing. But on the whole, if you asked an NPC for advice, and yes, in Morrowind this is a thing, asking NPCs for advice, you would eventually be told not to assume you are able to complete a job just because your superior gives it to you. And then in the event you get over your head, you should leave, rest, rearm, and try again when you're better prepared. This was organic information placed in the world to tell you how to play the video game. It's really cool, but it's also very missable information for players who didn't talk to every NPC about every topic. Not only can players miss organic information like this, but Morrowind is also lacking in other areas, such as impressing upon the player sufficiently how important it is to manage fatigue prior to battle, and of course the meta context of a skill being 30 or above is usable and below that is pain. Getting all the necessary information across to 100% of players, this process is undoubtedly flawed. But getting back to the topic of level scaling, Morrowind mechanically has more or less the same type of level scaling as the later games with their leveled lists. That is to say, when not encountering a unique named enemy, what types of non-unique monsters you will encounter will be based on your character level. That means in an unmodified vanilla Morrowind, there will be 3 tiers of animals: normal, diseased, and blighted, each a stronger level than the last, but they will have very specific spawn locations. Despite having more or less the same underlying system as Oblivion and Skyrim, Morrowind really only applies it sparingly to stop the leveling player from being bored during overland traversal. The moment you run into a bandit, you'll notice something. All the bandits in the base game, that is to say Vardenfell, have unique names. Every single dungeon trash bandit is a unique individual with their own name, equipment, and skills based on their NPC class. The impact to Morrowind's game design is that scaling is minimized, and you'll learn that not all dungeons are created equal. The level 1 bandits you kill at the beginning of the game are not the same as the level 20 bandits you'll encounter later. And this element of game design is what people refer to as encounter zones. The concept of encounter zones isn't rare at all. In fact, it's more common to see RPGs with encounter zones than it is to see RPGs with level scaling. If you go to a particular location, it's inhabited with enemies of a certain strength that you can over-prepare for. Setting aside tabletop, which I consider to be both the genesis and the truest form of RPG, when we get into the video game space of role-playing games, they are not open world at all, but rather linear progression tracks, like adventure games that possess RPG elements. In the earliest entries of classic Final Fantasy, you were expected to grind a little bit in major areas to minimize difficulties later, unless you wanted to be extremely strategic with your combat choices and luck. As time went on, these linear role-playing games began to shift away from requiring grinding to being more focused on obtaining certain items or skills or some kind of alternate progression type from making kills, such as challenges or quests to stay ahead of the game's encounter zone progression. Obviously, games still exist to this day where you can grind out and out-prepare, and that's great. I love diversity in game design. I wouldn't want to just be playing the same game forever. In Morrowind, a power leveling player is likely going to break the base game's level scaling by around level 40 entirely. So most players assume that there's no scaling at all. But if you travel to the Blood Moon expansion, you'll run into berserkers and other enemies who are not uniquely named, and who do in fact scale in level from 5 to 20 to 40 to 60, depending on what leveled list bracket the player happens to be in. These enemies can prove a challenge for players who are just entering their brackets, but are quickly outpaced by players with optimized builds, good equipment, to the point where some people still don't notice the existence of any level scaling. Player will just make a snap decision that the game is either easy or hard based on when in Blood Moon's brackets they decide to tackle it. But due to the size of the level brackets, coming back later can be a viable strategy. The problem with Oblivion is that in an attempt to have a system that will always present an interesting challenge to the player regardless of the player's level, the concept of leveling and then coming back when you're stronger does not exist in Oblivion. In Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion, there is a leveled list that determines the type of enemies you will encounter within a level bracket. The higher the player level is, the higher bracket the player will engage with. Higher level enemy types have more abilities and are generally stronger for any level. But the actual monsters that appear, their stats, will scale infinitely with the players. Because there's a soft cap on player skills, that is to say around 100, and you can raise them a little bit higher with items, effects, or cheats. There is, however, a hard cap on 100 for stats, and the tier of weapons and armor that the player can obtain caps at 30. The intent is obvious in Oblivion. This was before the remastered changed the difficulty from a slider to a series of presets. You were expected to move the slider left for easier or right for harder depending on how your build made the game feel in order to make the player most comfortable. This, however, is at odds with the idea of difficulty and challenge. Most people who seek out difficulty want to be able to accomplish it paradoxically their own way without guides, but also in a standard sort of way that's comparable to others. That's why if you have a difficulty in a game labeled normal that not everyone can accomplish in a single run without failure, people will complain about it rather than lowering the difficulty and trying again. Thus, in the greater AAA gaming space, hard became normal, normal became easy, and easy became brain dead. But Oblivion really doesn't fit into this box well due to its level scaling. The more granular approach from the difficulty bar is how you're supposed to play Oblivion, as far as the game design goes, even if that's not satisfying to the player. Not satisfying to be told, turn the difficulty down a little bit. If you were to disable all the scaling and add encounter zones to Oblivion, like Ascuro's Oblivion Overhaul does, then yes, at that point you absolutely can switch to presets like the Oblivion Remaster, and its use case makes sense at that point. There's just one problem with adding encounter zones to an open world game where you can go anywhere, anytime. Oblivion doesn't have strict conveyance to guide the player from point A to point B to point C. The game will basically give you quests anywhere, anytime, without any indicator as to what kind of encounter zone it's sending you to. Meaning that if you install a mod like Ascuro's Oblivion Overhaul and add encounter zones to the game, most of these will be sending you into death traps you are not prepared for. And if you just wander around aimlessly in the open world, you'll inevitably end up in an encounter zone well above your level and get stomped hard. There is an OOO, hints and spoiler guide online that you can find, which will help you get started and keep you more or less in the correct lane for progression. It's quite good if you use the optional attached spoiler map, but following a PDF file out of game isn't nearly as satisfying as exploring the open world yourself and then having clear signpostage telling you where to go. In Morrowind, you can become acquainted with Daedric Ruins architecture pretty clearly and know exactly what kind of encounter zone that's going to be. In Oblivion, forts and other dungeons are just kind of like doors in the ground or structures behind trees. Very easy to miss. Because the landscape looks pretty samey, suddenly you'll have a powerful enemy come out of a nearby dungeon entrance onto the road and stop you. That's pretty ordinary in Oscuro's Oblivion overhaul. But for people who want a challenge, they can be satisfied that the world is made up of different strengths in different locations, and they do have to be careful. But on the flip side, they can increase their own level without having to worry about making their experience worse. If you want to take Oblivion to its utmost extreme, the FCOM Convergence mod will combine Oscuro's with 3 other major overhauls to create a seamless, unleveled experience in Oblivion. Good luck installing it though. It's a pain in the butt, tends to crash a lot. I usually recommend just sticking with just 2, like Oscuro's and Masker's Oblivion overhaul. Masker's is compatible with basically everything, and eventually I'd like to have a video talking about Masker's because it's one of my favorites. All in all, unlike Daggerfall, Morrowind, or Skyrim, Oblivion modding is pretty miserable, so I'd recommend using a prefab mod pack to get the overhauls you want in place. But let's step out of modding for just a second and talk about the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim. A good chunk of the people who have found me have done so because I talk about Skyrim a lot. Skyrim is simultaneously one of my favorite games, and also a game that I criticize the most. It has the most lost potential out of any Elder Scrolls game, in my opinion. It is the most streamlined and simplified. The main quest characters are, to me, largely unlikable. Despite that, it's my favorite Bethesda sandbox. First and foremost, for the landscape, towns, dungeons, the way everything is built nice and densely, especially when it's used for modding. Although, we are getting ahead of ourselves on that last part. Skyrim, like Oblivion, is level scaled, but they've done a lot under the hood to make sure that player power is easier to build with level, to the point where eventually moving the difficulty setting up to a higher level is a matter of ensuring you are able to have a satisfying level of combat and not just kill everything in one hit. In Oblivion, it was very easy to make a suboptimal character that made you sad against the game's level scaling, but in Skyrim, you really have to avoid combat basically at all if you want to level up a weak character. In short, because the system is simpler and the player power is at a higher average, the presence of scaling isn't that bad. Skyrim does have a few mods that remove level scaling. Chief among them is Requiem, the role-playing overhaul. It's important to note that all of the mods that remove level scaling only really do so for vanilla, that is to say base game NPCs, without a massive amount of patching. Anything that is unpatched will break Requiem's intended flow, and will probably break any other mod that removes level scaling. Unlike Oscuro's Oblivion overhaul, Requiem for Skyrim is meticulously tuned to be a standalone RPG adventure with a steady progression of encounter zones, the types of loot you find where, which enemies drop what. All of it has been designed in a way that, unless tampered with by other mods, will lend itself to a very particular experience. That's why Requiem is called the role-playing overhaul, because it styles itself in the vein of classic computer role-playing games more than modern Elder Scrolls games. This means that adding a new weapon, monster, location, quest, so on, can break the intended experience entirely. It is completely possible to patch almost anything to be Requiem compatible on a technical level, but you generally shouldn't be adding that new content in the first place. Still, with Requiem being as spectacular as people consider it to be, Skyrim still wasn't designed for it. There are some hints in the game, such as a book which will suggest certain locations, but for the most part, you're going to want to be looking online. Requiem Danger Levels Map, or Requiem Levels Area, or other Reddit posts. Something that isn't nearly as satisfying as organically exploring the world. The alternative is to find a high-level area by dying in one hit and wondering what happened. So why do an overwhelming number of people have a problem with Oblivion's level scaling, but don't think too much of it for Skyrim? I mentioned earlier that it mostly boiled down to how much power they were giving the player. In Oblivion, if you don't want to move the difficulty setting around, playing comfortably meant being either lucky or picking your level up strategically. This scaling system was one of my primary motivators to stop playing my Oblivion Remastered playthrough after I'd finished the main quest in Shivering Isles. The idea was that if I continued to raise my skills, enemies would get harder without my strength increasing. Ironic because in my classic Oblivion playthrough, which I was running concurrently, the Oblivion XP mod allowed me to earn experience points that I could assign to stats and skills and continue to gain power despite the fact my level number kept going up. Now, when you look at the idea that we would want to stop playing Oblivion because the difficulty of the monsters keeps going up, the logical point of view would be to say, okay, well, just lower the game's difficulty to compensate for that. But I think a lot of people want to be able to say they played the game beginning to end on a specific difficulty. Not necessarily as something they want to show to others to prove themselves, but rather a way of viewing their own progression as a player. From a child or a casual player who uses cheats, to someone who plays on normal difficulty, to someone who progresses to higher difficulties. You can't have that kind of progression if you have to fiddle with the difficulty levels mid-game all the time. So to the challenge-oriented players, those who want to see themselves grow, they are consigned to either not having a good time because the game punishes them for not changing the difficulty, or not having a good time because they have to min-max their playthrough to an extreme degree. I think that most of this just comes from Oblivion's growing pains as a Bethesda game. This is when Bethesda began to change how they started dealing with things. Morrowind 2 was a product of its own time. My personal take is that I don't like level scaling very much. I didn't care for it in Final Fantasy VIII after going through a standard set of encounter zones in Final Fantasy VII, and I don't care for the heavy-handed way it's been used in more recent Bethesda games. There's something that feels very, very good about going to an area, getting beaten, leaving, preparing properly, coming back, and winning. Preparing by either raising your numbers or obtaining very specific items, and then destroying that encounter. Like on Halloween when I was playing as Hector the Devil Forge Master, and I devil forged a dragon with a very, very specific Dracula killing build that carpet bombed him to death. Some people don't realize it too, but on some level, that too is an RPG. The same way Pokemon is. There are many, many games out there where you can choose to challenge yourself by under-preparing or making the game easy by over-preparing. Although this isn't limited to RPGs, this is a hallmark of most classic RPGs with static encounters. You play through the game's content in order to prepare for the final challenges. And how prepared you are depends on how much of the game you experienced and how you decide to go about experiencing it. That's my take anyway. Level scaling isn't the death sentence for my enjoyment, but when it's done poorly, it can ruin people's experiences. And when it's done properly, it can still rob people of the feeling of progression, those moments where they can under-prepare or over-prepare for an encounter. It really is those hybrid encounters like Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind. A light touch of scaling where the system shines. When scaling is done right, the player will question if it exists at all. So, what do you all think? Can you think of any games where you really liked level scaling? I have a few on the top of my head, but I would say any recommendations carry gigantic asterisks, and I'd like to think about those a little further before talking about them. Main reason I want to ask everyone else's opinion. What do you all think about level scaling in video games? And with that all said, we'll call this video complete. I'll be talking at you all again soon. Have a good one.
Faith in the morrow. Those are fine words. But not for me. As one who travels through time, I see the morrow a bit differently. All the same, the flow of time has stabilized at last. For myself, I think I will go far into the future and see what awaits. There is one great battle yet to be fought. The final battle between Lord Dracula and the humans. Perhaps they will remember your fight. Or perhaps it will start anew.
See you later, Saint Germain.